artist, musician, great guy. We're really privileged to have him here today. Tonight he flies out to Paris. He's commissioned to do some artwork in Paris. So he'll tell us, I won't steal this, I know I'm probably just here. But without further ado, please welcome Jeremy, and I'm sure you're going to look forward to what we're going to get today. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I start, I acknowledge country in my grandfather's language. And natuna na pore na dunga ana na yopere na koka yaranji na wawore. Nawore na turabo. Watera na maapore na nyigi. Tatera na maapore na gapanyang na wawore na binga. In my father's language, and it talks about the fact that we're either saltwater or freshwater people. You know, that at some point, you know, we've either crossed saltwater or freshwater to get here and to gather here on the Turrbal country. It's always a privilege. I've spent so much of my life up around on this country, and you know, so much influence of, you know, of my artwork especially has been influenced by, you know, stories of the Turrbal elders, of Yagura elders, but of elders who have, I guess, given me the time to help me grow as a young person. It's certainly lovely to re-engage or to catch up with people I haven't seen since we were in Los Angeles or in America. How many? I don't know. What was that? 17 years ago. So 20 years ago. So it's funny that you go all the way around the world to meet Mob, and then you come back here, and 20 years later you can finally meet Mob again. You know. So it is. I want to thank everyone for giving up their time to come today. And obviously, any time I speak, I want it to be as open and to have people have the ability to ask whatever questions they want to ask. In an hour, it's very hard to capture, or it's very hard for me to sort of share as much, you know, share all the things that I want to share. But I guess in the nature of you know, Reconciliation Queensland, I wanted to start with a poem that I wrote, which is, you know, I write a lot of poetry. A lot of it has to do with you know, different political sort of things that happen in our country, especially when we have things like Australia Day, all these different things. People ask me, how do I feel about it? And so the best way for me to write about these things is often just to capture it in poetry, and then I usually just stay very quiet over those particular days. That way I don't have to engage in, you know, sort of in conversations that are just meaningless sometimes, and sometimes just more hurtful than anything. So this one is one I wrote about, you know, is simple. Let me just find it. It's funny, my beautiful little girl Jakari, she said to me, you know what, Dad, I've never seen you do a speech except on the internet. and so it is lovely to have her come along with me today. She's the youngest of my children, and so now she gets to see me do it in real life, and then it's going to be on the internet, so you'll be able to watch it on the internet later on. So this was just called Terra Nullius. Terra Nullius was declared as Cook invaded this sacred shore, instantly dismissing our existence, let alone acknowledging any of our ancient lore. But now we're calling for change to rewrite what was written wrong, because this is our place of dreaming, and this is where we belong. Yet this discussion forces many into anger and attack. But every time you deny invasion, you march this nation back. Why are you so afraid to rewrite the wrongs of how this land was built? Surely you're beyond the bones of ancestral stolen guilt. When you say get over it, it hits a painful nerve. We don't say that on Anzac Day as we bow our heads and observe. There is no shame in admitting the history wrote it wrong, nor are we saying this is our place and not where you belong. What's the big deal? Well, wouldn't you prefer the truth despite how it makes you feel? So if you're saying or simply having that thought, wouldn't you just prefer true history with something finally taught? When we talk of the red blood stain across this land, it's not to make you uncomfortable, it's just to help you understand. When we tell you of our stolen children, it's not to tear us apart, It's just to help us carry a burden too big for our aching heart. The truth is, it only took 15 minutes long before they fired their first gun. That's a part of history that simply cannot be undone. So it's time to change your words and just call it for what it was. Invasion is the truth in a stolen dreaming of the land we now call Oz. So many people get so uncomfortable about this word invasion.
You can pause for a clap.
Oh. But people get uncomfortable about the word invasion, and they think it's an attack, but it's just simply the truth. It's simply the truth. I am a very proud Gokka Yaranji person. I have family connections into the Gumbaynggirr people from my grandmother, from my father's family as well. But unlike, it hasn't always been my life. It hasn't always been that fortunate to be able to stand up and be able to tell someone where I'm from. That I was born up in Mossman Gorge, in one of the most picturesque, beautiful places of the world. I have a white mother and I have an Aboriginal father. I was then, my mother, as a very young mother, was like many people back in those days, you know, it was said to have brought shame upon her family and different things. And so I was taken back to Mossman Gorge Hospital, where my mum assumed that I would be placed up for adoption, but unfortunately I became a ward of the state. In the first 5 years of my life, I was in 17 different homes. I was so badly abused, both physically and sexually abused in the first 5 years of my life, they transferred me from state as a ward of the state of Queensland to a ward of the state New South Wales. And so I arrived in Sydney at 6 years old. At 6 years old, I barely had 100 words in my vocabulary. That is the state of trauma, and that is the state of despair that I was in. At 6 years old, I was then placed into one of the most beautiful, loving families that you could ever be placed into, although it seemed like the lies would continue. My mother raising me, that would raise me for the next sort of 5 years, was a Samoan lady, and my father raising me was Māori. And still today, my parents swear, black and blue, that they were told that I was from a Maori background. And so I was raised until I was 12 years old, almost 13 years old, with this very strong connection to what the Māori know as tangata whenua, this mana, this feeling, this relationship with the ancestral world that comes through kapa haka and the lineage of their cultural dances. At 13 years old, I found myself in juvenile detention for the very first time. And it was at this very point, in 1991, I think, in 1991, the Freedom of Information Act changed, whereby children that were ward of the state could find their family or could find the information about their biological family. In 1992, it was that I found myself in a juvenile detention centre for the very first time. The next 6 years, or almost 5 years, almost 6 years, my life would be defined by incarceration. That I served 11 sentences in juvenile detention centres and adult facilities between the ages of 13 and 18 years old. That I only completed about 8 days after grade 8, and still today have never finished any formal education. But for me, my life was defined by the walls that incarcerated me. And in fact, what's interesting is, as we often reflect, I want to grow up to be just like my dad. Well, I was growing up to be just like my dad. When I met my father, my biological father, in 1995, I met him through I was introduced to him through a series of photographs, and the first thing that I realized was my dad looked just like me. My dad was dressed like me, my dad looked like me, and my dad was obviously in prison just like me. My dad was in prison up in far northern Queensland at Lotus Glen correction centre. So much of my young life was defined by prison. In fact, it's kind of this very scary reality that we face, is that when I reflect back on my young life between the ages of 6 and 12, where my identity was shaped by the Polynesian culture and by the Maori culture and the connection to Tanga Te Whenua. It was based around this sense of pride and this sense of strength that came from performing in kapa haka. And then for the next 6 years of my life, I would define my life by prison. I would define that as my relationship to my Aboriginal culture. The scariest part about that was it was easier for me to learn about my identity as an Aboriginal person inside prison than it was on the outside of prison. When I first went into Carryong Juvenile Detention Centre at 13 years old, it was 81% Indigenous kids. Today, it's 73. So in 20 years, it hasn't changed a bit. I was in Darwin last week working in Dondale Correction Centre, and right now in Darwin, 100% of the kids in jail are Aboriginal. 100%. It's a reality that once shaped my life and unfortunately shapes so many of the lives of young Aboriginal people today. At 18 years old, well, let's wind that back a bit. At 16 years old, I met my grandfather for the very first time. And this would change my life so dramatically. One, I'd never seen a black person look like my grandfather before. He was one of the most beautiful people, but he shocked me in his appearance, in all of his appearance. And there's two things about my grandfather that I'll never forget. And it's the smell of log cabin tobacco. That we all remember, but my grandfather always was rolling log cabin tobacco. In fact, through all of my trouble in life that I'd lived, I never smoked a cigarette until I went back to the bush to be with my grandfather. And it was only because I used to roll these cigarettes for him when we were driving and rolling in the motor car. And but it's that smell, and it's that scent, that smell that it brings this nostalgic memory of my grandfather and meeting my grandfather. And the other thing was just this man's appearance, that it had so much knowledge and so much wisdom just captured in every single wrinkle that was upon his face. Meeting my grandfather, it also put me in this place of like, wow, now I'm even more confused, because you are either too white to be black, you're too black to be white. Where do I belong? Where do I come from? I just want to fit in. Where do you want to go? Do you want to get out? Go, run. Go to the books. One of the interesting things, I remember seeing a picture book for the first time at 6 years old when I was placed into that permanent care. And so to come into a library with my daughter to do this sort of thing is it's a beautiful thing to see on, with technology, and for all of its great failings technology has, one of the beautiful things that I get to share is my daughter. She'll call me every night, and no matter where I am in the world, whether it's just where she's with her mother or I'm traveling overseas or whatnot, she'll call me and she reads her book to me every night. And it's a great privilege for me to hear her read, because as someone that didn't see a book until I was 6 years old, reading's never been that easy for me. And so to be able to stand up and speak is something that I found my natural place or natural comfort, but to read a book is something that I'll never probably ever really be able to do, because of the result of, so one, the early foundations of education, but two, dyslexia, and also, it just wasn't something that was ever presented to me. So to hear her thrill or to hear her joy in being able to read to me is a great privilege that, in affording a child education is a great thing that I'm able to afford my children. My grandfather came down to Sydney to meet me. I was 16 years old. He was with my grandmother. I remember meeting both my grandmother and grandfather for the first time, the shock, the confusion, and then trying to understand, well, how does this help me from where I am? My grandfather said two very, very important things to me that very day. My grandfather said, "What do you want to be?" He said, "You can either be that number, 164320, which was my min number, my incarceration number, and that's all you'll ever be. Or you can dream to become somebody." And I thought it was a pretty arrogant statement for someone to say, you can dream to become somebody, when my life was defined, or the biggest dream that I could have was about 2 meters in front of me, which was that wall that stood around us. That on the walls, they were empty. There was nothing that was inspiring inside the prisons, nothing that told you could be anything more than just an inmate. And still today, it's one of the big things that I'm trying to change, is trying to change what the inside walls of a juvenile prison look like, or even an adult facility. Because once you're in there, it should not be what you see your life as for the rest of your life. I certainly know it wasn't just meeting my grandfather, it took a little bit. But by the time I was 18 years old and I'd served 7 months in an adult facility, I realized that there had to be more to life. There had to be more to life than just what was being determined for me. In fact, I knew the very moment that my life would change was because my life would change as a result of this one thing. My grandfather said to me, if you can sit in all of your shadows and still find the moon, you will know your way home. And one night I was sitting in my cell and I had this very tall, like just, the little, the nine squares in the corner of a room that gave ventilation. And I'd picked out all the wire out of them because we often used to pass things through these holes. But I was sitting on the floor of my prison cell and I looked up and I could see the moon through those nine gaps in the corner. And I thought, this is it. My life has to be worth more than just what has been said it is right now. I got released from juvenile detention. I left Sydney and went straight back up to Cairns. My grandfather and grandmother picked me up at Cairns and we drove up to Mareeba. And from Mareeba we drove further north out to, we drove to Lakeland, and then from there we headed out to where some of our traditional rock paintings are. And we stopped at a place called Battle Camp, and Battle Camp Station was the station that my grandfather was born at. And I would spend the next couple of months living with my grandfather on the cattle station there. And I went from being able to steal a car very quickly to being able to have to ride a horse. And I'd never seen a horse before in my life. And this changed my life dramatically, because I always say that the two things that helped save my life were my grandfather and horses. That the most beautiful thing in the world. And in fact, that exchange now, I'm teaching both my two daughters who are here in this country. I have one other daughter. I have a 21-year-old daughter that lives in Canada. But my two daughters now, I'm teaching them how to ride horses. And it's this beautiful relationship of the things that saved my life and being able to give them so much joy in teaching them how to ride horses. It's a great gift that would live with me forever. Living with my grandfather from 1997 it was, all the way up until the year 2000. And we travelled across the whole of the Cape where my grandfather was mustering. We travelled down into Mount Isa, we travelled up into Borroloola. My grandfather was a very well-renowned cattleman or ringer. And I used to just travel for years. I travelled with him just, driving cattle all the way across to Kununurra at one point. And one day we were banked up in Yirrkala in northeast Arnhem Land, and my grandfather's mother was from Gulawinka, and so we had ties across into the Yolngu people, and so we were camped on that land, and we had ceremony about to start. And I was sitting down with all of the old people and I was singing a song called Bonba, which was all about the butterfly. It was a song for one of the old ladies who had passed away. And I guess what had happened at that time, it was March 2000. There were the three brothers there at that time. And they witnessed, this albino looking kid sitting on the beach singing all these traditional, Manukau songs to all the old people on the beach. And they were kind of perplexed at what was going on. How is this young kid singing all of these songs? How does he know all of these songs? Why is he singing the songs? And so at the end of Bonba, we were walking back up to the camp and I was with my grandfather. I had the yiraka in my hand and these three brothers stopped me. And they were with a young person there as well. And they asked me, what's the deal here? How do I know these songs? Why? I was explaining that my grandfather had taught me all of these songs, and that, you know, that pretty much the only thing I ever wanted to do in my life was to play didgeridoo or to play yiraki and to sing traditional Manukau songs. And these three brothers were three beautiful brothers from Brisbane, or just south of Brisbane. Actually, they were Mullinjali brothers. They were from David Page, Stephen Page and Russell Page. And they were preparing for they were doing all the choreography for the Sydney Olympic Games. And they would just start a Bangara dance, and so they asked me if I was interested in going back to Sydney to prepare for the Sydney Olympic Games, and this would be where my life would change very dramatically. I left Sydney in April of 2000 with Jakapura, one of our traditional Yolngu brothers, and moved down to Sydney and started preparing for the Sydney Olympics. I had this dream. I said to my grandfather, Yiraki Wawu is like the whole of Australia. I was saying to him, I want to play Yiraki in every place around Australia. And that was my lifelong ambition, my lifelong dream. In April, I got to Sydney. And in May, we were rehearsing at the Sydney Theatre Company, getting ready, starting all the rehearsals for the opening of the Sydney Olympics. And the Northern Territory Tourism Commissioner walked in with Daryl Summers. And it was at the time they were creating that advertisement campaign, you never know if you never go. And they needed a didgeridoo player, or they needed a yiraki player to help them on this thing called the Territory Muster. And I said, well, I needed some extra work to get some money. I said that I'd do it. And I had no idea what I was signing up for, but 3 weeks later I arrived back into Sydney, and I'd played didgeridoo in every single capital city of this country. I'd played in every major regional town, and I was kind of like, fuck, what do I do now? This was supposed to take me my whole life. And I called my grandfather. I said, Napa, old man, Yaka, I'm going to play around the whole world. And my grandfather laughed. He laughed. And the Sydney Olympics came, September came around, and I was fortunate enough to be with one other brother as the opening Iraqi players that opened up the whole of the Sydney 2000 Olympic Games. And this would be the great catalyst for change. The night that Cathy Freeman won that race, which was probably the time that I say is probably the greatest moment of reconciliation our country has ever seen, where Australians, not divided by white, black, or their religion they seem to focus or dream or believe in, but just Australians stood side by side proud of another Australian person who had just won the gold medal. It was no longer about the political, sort of ventures of why she was carrying the Aboriginal flag, or what, was it right, was it wrong? It was just they were proud of this person. It truly was the greatest notion of reconciliation that I believe this country has ever seen. The night that Cathy Freeman won that race was probably the night that changed my life the most, because I had been asked to play didgeridoo up in the suite for the Australian ambassador to Switzerland. And I was playing didgeridoo in the corner just like as a little bit of entertainment. At the end of that, they were asking me, have I ever been overseas? And would I be interested in coming to Switzerland? And I had to tell them that I needed 7 years of non-conviction before I could leave this country. About 3 months later, so that was September, it was December the 11th. December the 11th, the year 2000, Australian Federal Police rocked up at my front door, and I thought, fuck, what have I done now? I thought, oh no, my past has come back again. In fact, even my brother who I was living with, he's like, what have you done? I was like, I don't know, but hide everything. But the Australian Federal Police were there, and they're like, Mr. Donovan, I'm like, yes. And they're like, oh, we need you to come with us. We've got some forms for you to sign. And what had happened was the Australian ambassador to Switzerland had organised for me to get, as a result, on the back of the Swiss embassy, a diplomatic passport to go to Geneva to speak to the United Nations about, sort of the abuse, the significant amounts of abuse, and how that had shaped my life. But, sort of the music, the Aboriginal music and the culture. And in February of 2001, I left Australia for the very first time and travelled to Geneva and played didgeridoo in the United Nations for the very first time. And this would become, my life. for the next, until 2011. For 10 years, I travelled this country on a diplomatic passport. I travelled to pretty much I played didgeridoo at every single Australian embassy around the world. You know, speaking at some of the most incredible places. I've played with London Philharmonic Orchestra, German Philharmonic Orchestra. I've played in Buckingham Palace twice, in the White House. I've had my own show at the Paris Casino in Las Vegas. You know, like, all because of my grandfather, really, and this great dream and this great desire to want to spread this message and to spread my passion and my pride in my Goka Yaranji people, but the greater people, the Aboriginal people of this country, and to share their story and to share their magic and to share all the beauty amidst, you know, the media's constant desire to portray what is the worst of our lifestyle. I wanted to portray the best of our lifestyle, the beauty, the artwork, and the music that came with it. One of the best things that I ever did in my life, for me, was to take my grandmother to Las Vegas, and my grandmother, you know, we flew to Las Vegas because I had the opening of this show in Paris Casino, and we flew to Las Vegas, and we get picked up in this limousine at the airport, and my grandmother goes, "Hey boy, what do you think, you're real good, eh?" And then we get back to the hotel, and up in the hotel room there's this massive spa bath. It was so big, I'd never seen a spa bath like it. And my grandmother go, "Boy, you be proper disco didgeridoo, eh?" And so, but to be able to take my grandmother across there and to be able to share that world with my grandmother was one of the most beautiful things, that, you know, to be able to take her to shows that once upon a time she had only ever maybe dreamed about, but to allow her to be part of it was a really special thing. The didgeridoo and the flutes, or which are Native American flutes, have become so much of my life. They go everywhere with me. You know, while today the majority of my work is, you know, either public speaking or my artwork, the music is who I am. The music was my voice when I didn't have the confidence to have the words to speak, and it gave me a platform to share my music and to get my confidence on what it was that I wanted to share. And then as I've grown older, I've found myself in roles and responsibilities whereby being able to speak to people and to be able to influence audiences using our words in terms of talk about the tragedies of the past, whether it be the massacres, whether it be about the stolen generation, but do so in a way that does not attack the audience and make the audience feel uncomfortable, but do so in a way that says that this is not just our history, that this belongs to us, as in you and me, because the history of this country is the history of this country. And I think that we need to be brave enough as a nation, not just as Australians, but also as Aboriginal people. We need to be able to be brave enough and to be able to heal our own trauma, because our trauma has been so great that we actually open our hearts to allow other people to join with us to walk and to help carry the burden and the pain that has been passed down to us, that we've inherited from our families for so long. And I think that we come to an event like today whereby there's 30 people in a room, and it gives me great pride that, you know, we have a room that has Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people sitting in here, and we are sharing the same experience. That the experience is exactly the same. The reason why you're here is exactly the same. It's an opportunity for us to share. And this was how our culture has survived for so many thousands of years, is because we shared. We didn't stop sharing just because we didn't like the person or they weren't allowed to learn that, but we simply shared because that was how our culture would survive and continue for so many thousands of years to follow from here. I've been really blessed with my artwork. My artwork is one of the things that's probably changed, you know, sort of given me the greatest platform for for a voice these days. In fact, I had a licensing agreement with Nescafe. I think we have one of the tins up there, which is just the 1 kilo tin, which you can still order online through Wink, which was the former Staples. But this put Aboriginal art into coffee on the shelves of families. We had it selling on the 140 gram tins of coffee, through Coles and Woolies and IGA. And this basically put a story, a conversation into the families. It put Aboriginal artwork on the coffee tins of kitchens around Australia, and now this one can still continue to be ordered through Wink, which is the office supply company, but it can just be ordered online. But it was for me, it was a great thing to run into the Coles and the Woolworths. And when the coffee tins were in there, and my little daughter would run in there, and they cut this painting up into 4 different designs, but one of the designs is the stencil of the hands that are in the background, and they're her hands, and so she used to run in there and always put the tins in order so her ones were at the front of yeah. So, but just to say, just for my kids to be able to walk in, just for them to be able to go to school and say, my dad's artwork is on those tins, is the sense of pride that she would get. In fact, it was probably culture that was the thing that brought us closest together when I was going through the divorce with, in my marriage, because my little daughter and me, all of the kids, but my daughter, who was the youngest at the time, I said to her, she said, "Dad, I miss you." And I said to her, "Nai malapana na yopere," is like, and she could understand. She said, "Yes, Dad," which simply meant, "Baby, can you see the stars?" And she walked outside, and I said, "As long as you could," I said, "Na malapana yopere na kapanyang na wawore na dapa." It's like, little girl, as long as you can see the stars and I can see the stars, it means we're standing side by side. And it was that cultural connection that I'd shared with my daughter through all of the time that she'd sat with me when I was painting, when I was talking to her, when she was watching these YouTube video clips, that it actually is the thing that brought us the closest together, because I could speak language to her about Nagidja, I could speak about the moon, I could speak Namalapa, I could speak about the stars, and she could look back at me and she could know exactly what we were talking about. And even still today when I travel, I can say Namalapa na yopuri. It's like she knows that we're talking about the stars. She knows that I'm talking about the moon, and she knows that no matter where I am in the world, that we're always together. And I think it's one of the things it's the one thing that I shared with the kids that I didn't share with my ex-wife, was language. And that was the most beautiful part about things, is that I could speak to them, and it made me realize the significance of keeping culture alive was because they understand it, and they carry our culture, and they carry these stories, and these stories would be, such significant things, for them. Even to, the curiosity of our children, and the fortunate side of being able to speak language is that, when I go down to the beach, she asks, "Dad, what do I call the sand? And what do I call different things?" She wants to know every interpretation of everything, in language. And for me, it's such a beautiful thing to be able to give her, is a connection to our language, which is a connection to her culture, which is a connection to the Goko Yaranji country, which she hasn't spent so much time on. But it still gives her a place in all of that, in that way of life, in that culture. And so it is a great privilege to be able to pass on, the culture. This year has been, probably my biggest year in artwork, in terms of I painted 2 of the largest Aboriginal artworks that have ever been painted in the world, which one was they were both for Barangaroo down in Sydney. They were 14.2 metres long. I sympathise with Michelangelo. I sympathise with him. Only I didn't have to paint a ceiling. I was painting the ground. I never went blind from the paint that dripped in my eyes. But I ended up with bursitis and had to have 2 surgeries on both my elbows. as a result of these two paintings that took 5.5 months to paint. I was just locked in this room. I used to tell people I felt a bit like that movie with Tom Hanks, the Terminal, where you're stuck in this building and no one else is in there to talk to, and you start talking to the walls and you start going a bit crazy. And yeah, I'm sure that there were many people in Barangaroo that thought I was completely crazy at times. That I was, but it's a great privilege to be able to have my artwork, hang in places like that will live forever. I just turned down the biggest art contract that I would have ever received, which was to do all the artwork for the new Crown Casino, and it was purely as a result of one thing, is that I said that I would do the artwork if they allowed me to paint with the development of the building, but they didn't want to. They just wanted to purchase the paintings, and I said, well, I don't want the money. And that's a pretty hard thing to walk away from, because it was about $300,000, but the reality is that I don't want to have my artwork just hanging in a place where it actually wasn't cared for or it wasn't respected. And so I walked away from that opportunity, purely knowing that, I have my values, I have my integrity. I'm happy for my artwork to hang in all sorts of corporate places, but the fact is that our art is living and it's breathing. And that if it had been able to be built with the development, so it moved with the development, and I thought that maybe they would be a little bit wise to, the reality is that the majority of the Asian gamblers are very big on Feng Shui, and that maybe they should have considered what I was saying to them, but I'm not that one to teach that lesson. So it does, my artwork, it gives me great opportunity to, to sort of put a conversation into families' homes. It gives me the opportunity to be able to introduce people to my artwork. But my artwork is definitely a reflection of the two worlds that I grew up in, that I do a lot of very modern, very contemporary work, which is using aerosol cans, teaching kids how to, do, sort of modern graffiti in a very positive way. We've just finished painting the walls of the inside of one of the prisons, whereby we're putting motivational quotes on the inside of the walls for the kids. So therefore we're changing the way these kids see themselves and see each other. And then obviously the traditional pieces, or the pieces whereby I'm using a contemporary background of graffiti and putting our traditional stories over the top, which is a reflection of the two worlds that I certainly have come from. It is, to be able to stand here today, knowing that tomorrow that I'll be on a plane flying to France, it's a great opportunity for me to be able to travel the world, to be able to share these stories. But would I put one thing in front of the other? No, because the reality is that I've long believed that the greatest place that's needed change is our place here in this country. And that coming to an event like this, sure, I could have thought of every excuse or every reason why I shouldn't be coming here today, but that really wouldn't be the truth of what I want to create change for. I'm going to spend the next 10 days over in France over painting a painting that, I probably won't speak to too many people in terms of, about the meaning or whatnot. I'll just produce this painting and I'll get out of there. But to be able to impact change here in this country is what I care about the most. And I think when we talk about reconciliation, I think sometimes we get the word wrong. And I say this often, because a reconciliation was what they tried to make me do when I was going through a divorce. It meant that I had an agreement and it broke down, and then we have to try and reconcile our differences. But the truth is, in this country, there was never an agreement. There never has been. And so I think we need to create a conciliation, a new dreaming, an agreement together whereby we as Australians today understand, that the history, the pain of the past belongs to all of us. It's not something that's denied, that I don't want to hear. It's been 250 years, you've got to get over it. Or it's been 250 years, why are you still like this? Like all of those times, every time I hear that, it sets us back as a nation, and it still says that so much work has to be done to be able to tell a story of why we need different measures to create equality. in this country, because equality is something that I think we all dream of, but is not something that we are all privileged to have access to. You know, only about 6 weeks ago in one of our schools up in Yirrkala, they had no running water for the day, and so the teachers decided it was better to give them cans of Coke. I mean, that's a really ugly situation, you know, and then they wonder why all the kids are hyperactive and can't sit still. Well, that's the truth, is that, you know, like the reality is that when water is more expensive than Coca-Cola, we have gone very, very wrong in this country. And so I think it is, you know, I get, you know, sort of depending on looking at the time, and I'm sort of a little bit more cagey on the time because of the drive that I've got to get back for. But does anyone have any questions that they want to ask about anything to do with, you know, my story before I go into a bit of music and play this flute? And yes?
Did you ever reconnect with your birth mum?
Yes. In fact, this year I'm having Christmas with my biological mum for the very first time ever. And you know, and I'm scared about it. Like I'm nervous about it, because I know. Listen, I'm a different person than my mum, and I speak to my mum all the time. My mum thinks I'm the most crazy human in the world, and I probably am compared to her. My mum's always saying, "Why can't you just live a normal life?" I said, "Because I'm not normal, mum." You know, so having Christmas with mum, you know, this year is going to be it's really exciting. You know, I don't get to have Christmas with my kids because they're going off with their mum, but for me to be able to go and have Christmas with my mum, it's something that I haven't had forever. So, yeah. Yep.
You said you had spent like 7 years in our Māori culture and as a Samoan.
Yep.
How did that impact you? Like, you were right entrenched in it, and you know, learning the dance and the movement of the culture.
I think for me at first I felt like I was very betrayed when I found out that I wasn't, and my mum and father felt like they'd betrayed me as well and let me down, because you know they were told that I was from a Māori background, and so my father really believed that if he could give me this connection to tangata whenua, that it would give me balance at a time in my life. Now these days I completely see the value, and in fact the very first time I ever danced in Bungal with my family, I realised the significant impact that Māori culture had on me, because it gave me a feeling and a place. And the moment I heard our old people singing, it reminded me of the way that it was when I heard old women singing for you to come onto the marae, all of those different things. And so the reality is that I still have a very close relationship. In fact, that my boys are doing kapa haka still today. Like, so I'm teaching my children about that stuff, because it really, like the Māori have this word, so when you refer to your family, it is referred to as whānau. But if you come into the family and you're adopted or you're foster, it's called whāngai, and the whāngai gives you a place still within the Tainui people. And so, you know, my family still refer to me as whāngai, and so for me to be able to give my kids access to understanding that is actually really is just honouring the fact of, you know, my mother and father gave me so much love between those years, between 6 and 12 years old. They really were the first people that gave me love. And I never want to forget that. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder what way you think you look like your grandfather.
Pardon?
How do you look like your grandfather?
How do I look like my grandfather? I don't look like my grandfather. Although I have hey? Yeah, some people say that I do, but you know, one of the most beautiful things that ever happened was I recorded a CD, and it was at the time that my grandfather's mourning was still going on, so no photos or anything could still be uncovered, and I sent it back to my grandmother to listen to, and my grandmother called me and she was very angry. She was yelling at me because she thought that I had recorded my grandfather's voice and put it into the recordings of me singing Manake, and I was saying Napa Napa, Amalaia, no, it's me, I'm singing that song. And she stopped and she said, "Boy, you sound like your grandfather." And so I think, you know, many people have said that, you know, when that man passed, you know, his voice became so much of my voice. And I guess everything of my grandfather, everything that he ever shared with me, it became such an important thing that I remember being at the rock paintings up at Laura. And my grandfather used to do some guided tours of the rock paintings of Split Rock, and I used to watch my grandfather try and translate from, you know, as a non-English speaker, you know, because English was his second or third language, and try and translate the meaning of these stories into English so the tourists could understand what these stories meant. And for me, one day when I'd been up there for about a year with him, I asked him if I could tell the story of these paintings, and I was an English speaker translating, you know, and I'd learnt the meaning of these stories, so I could tell the story in a way that we could understand. And it was the first time that I watched my grandfather really, you know, I watched tears roll down his face, because for the first time he saw people understand the meaning of these paintings and how significant they were, that he just wasn't able to translate it into English in a way that they could really understand what the meaning of this story was, because his interpretation of it was so vague, I guess, because of his translation. Yes.
No. Oh, here's my thing. So Jeremy, I'm interested in when you realised that, or when you first found out that you weren't from a Maori background. And I spent 5 years in New Zealand, and I watched how differently Maori are treated by society and government. And when I came back to Australia, that was the thing that got me into reconciliation, was that I said, oh my God, we're so behind the way Maori are treated. Our First people are treated a lot worse, or nowhere near as kind as Maori people are in their own country, even though it's not perfect.
Yeah.
When it became your truth, how did that make you feel when you realised that, you know, you thought you were part of what was a very strong culture, and then realising that different story here?
I was heartbroken. I was honestly flat out heartbroken when I found out, when I was told that I wasn't Māori and that in fact that I was Aboriginal. I was heartbroken because I didn't know what that meant. That I had never met an Aboriginal person before. Like, I might have competed against other Aboriginal kids on the sporting field, but I'd never sat down and had a conversation. And so now all of a sudden you're taking something away. I became, one, terrified that I was going to get taken away from this family again. And then, you know, because I thought, here we go again. You know, I just spent 5 years of just, you know, for the first time of stability in my life. I found a place, and then the only thing I knew about Aboriginal people was negative. That I'd never been exposed to positive stuff in my life. And I remember going to Bajura Children's Court, it was in Glebe, and I was in Bajura Children's Court, and I went to the bathroom and I shut the bathroom door, and there was an Aboriginal flag on the, you know, graffitied on the back of the door, and I thought, oh well, this is where I'm going to find out what Aboriginal is. And it was a tragic tale of discovering my identity in the walls inside prison, because that was the only exposure I had to Aboriginal culture, you know, down in New South Wales and in Sydney, in that part of Sydney as well. There was a Polynesian community where we were living, but there certainly was an Aboriginal community, and so therefore I didn't have any exposure to Aboriginal people. So going to jail was the only exposure, but certainly, I mean, it's very easy to see while you can never compare the two countries because the circumstances are completely different, but here's the difference. The first Māori doctor graduated 110 years before our first doctor. That's the difference in the worlds. That's the difference in what education does, is that education gives you a place in society that we weren't given for a lot longer. And without, you know, without education, you cannot compete in this modern world. And, you know, while I certainly I'm a very big supporter of education for our people, I don't believe it makes you one or the other. That, you know, for me, watching my kids become educated with a Western education, it has not separated them from their knowledge, or in fact, it's probably given them greater desire to protect their culture. Yeah. And even my eldest daughter, who is 21, Tilken, her mother is a Native American lady from Canada. And she's still, you know, she's going to graduate as a lawyer next year. And for me, she still has a connection to our culture from what I've been able to share with her in her life, even though I've been distant from her. I think the one thing about our culture is, and that I saw with the Native American culture, because while things are not perfect over there, they're still probably 40 years advanced, you know, from where we are. Especially in terms of the procurement of businesses and the procurement of services through Indigenous businesses. We've seen, you know, a lot of the lives of Canadian Aboriginal people, their lives have turned from being welfare dependent into, you know, sort of running Indigenous run and Indigenous owned and operated businesses, and that's created an economic landscape that is giving opportunity through, you know, and giving opportunity to equality. So.
Further question. You mentioned in Sydney Olympics when Kathy Freeman was being turning point, and that turning point is 20 years ago. How do you feel we've come in that 20 years, the first 20 years of this century?
Listen, I can say that what interaction I have with people today. People have a greater desire to want to learn. You know, people are not so afraid to, you know, to address the truths, you know, but the reality is we still live in a very white Christian country. That's a flat out honest, a very conservative, white, conservative Christian country. That's, you know, in actual fact, you know, we've become, you know, there's in some ways, political correctness has, you know, made us more afraid to have conversations than ever before. People are afraid to upset someone by what they say now because, you know, like I think sometimes cultural awareness has gone too far in terms of the fact that, you know, some cultural awareness trainings are just factual. They're not fact, they're just stories. And that I think cultural awareness has to be built on fact. And it has to be built on facts that are truth, that actually allow us to have real conversations together. Because the reality is the majority of Aboriginal people, and I would speak, you know, I believe I'm speaking on behalf of the Aboriginal people that are here today, is that they have a great love of sharing their stories, especially when people are willing to listen, that we want to, you know, and it makes us feel worthy when people listen to what we have to say. But it's only when, you know, things happen like the prejudice or systems. You know, I wrote a poem recently that was published in the New York Times, and it was called "Born in a Suit and Tie," and it was about, you know, depending on what I wear depends on how I get anywhere. Because, you know, when I'm traveling in a suit, yes, Mr. Donovan, how are you? If I just decide to rock around in just, you know, bare feet and covered in paint, you get treated so differently. It was the reason why I got rid of a nice car, because I didn't want to have, you know, someone treat you differently because of a nice car. And now I traded, you know, my kids hated it. They thought I was nuts. Like I traded a $60,000 car for a $5,000 car. And I, you know, purely because I was like, I don't want you to treat me differently when I pull up at the hotel just because I have this car versus this car. I don't want to be treated differently because of what I have. I want to be treated exactly the same because of who I am. And, you know, all of those things, I think, you know, what happened, you know, I don't have many material possessions, and I don't really care for many material possessions. Although the only thing I've ever wanted was a Mont Blanc pen. All right? It's kind of weird, you know, but that was it, a Mont Blanc pen. And it was only because these pens are very heavy and I've got big hands. I like to write, I like to sketch. I wanted a Mont Blanc pen. And I always said that if I sold a painting worth $25,000 or more, I'd go and buy a Mont Blanc pen. And I sold a painting for $25,000, and I was in Melbourne, and I went to go and buy a Mont Blanc pen. I had $8,000 in my pocket. And I walked in there and I just had a pair of shorts on and a pair of thongs, and I said, could I please have a look at this pen? And they said to me, oh, we don't let people handle our pens. And I was like, oh, fair enough. Anyway, hey?
What is it?
A Mont Blanc pen it's a wanker's pen. It's got like a little star on top. It's like, it's a brand, you know, like, yeah, but anyway. Yeah, it's like a Gucci pen, you know. But I didn't buy it on that day because they wouldn't let me handle the pens. Anyway, the next day I had a suit on and I was staying directly opposite it, and I went, fuck it, I'm just going to buy the pen. And so I walked over there and I said, could I please, and they're like, oh, do you want to hold these pens? And they like pretty much like, I said, are you mob blind? And they're like, what do you mean? And they're like, yesterday I came in here at 4:30 and all three of you are in here and you all told me that I wasn't allowed to touch the pens, and now all three of you are here rolling out the red carpet and want me to handle your pen. I was like, fuck you and your pens. And I did. I graffitied on the front of their window that night. So. Yeah. Yeah. I drew. Well, actually, yeah, I drew a picture that was very rude, you know, like of a part of a male's anatomy with the star that's on the top of it, you know. But I wrote my number. I was like, if you've got a problem, call me. Yeah, but the truth of it, well, you know, I'm still waiting for Mont Blanc to give me a free pen as a result. But no, but I do own one Mont Blanc pen, and that's you know. But the reality is that I hate the fact that we do get prejudice. We still, you know, like I was in Bunnings 2 weeks ago with my daughter, and I was just, you know, we're running around, and I saw that there was an undercover security guard in there, and I was like, Bubba, just come with me. And I picked her up. I had like a couple of items in my hand. I could see that he was watching me and following me. And so I made my way back to the toilet, and just before we got to the toilet, I put everything on the shelf, and I just sat there at the door, and the door swung open. He's like, where's the items you've got? I was like, I saw you following me before you even knew you're following me. I was like, and if you walk back, you'll see on the shelf every single item's out there. Those sort of things make me feel sick, you know, that people, you know, people judge you on what you wear. You know, like the night before the opening of my artwork in Barangaroo, I went to get a haircut, and I knew getting a haircut in Barangaroo is going to cost you a fortune anyway. But I went in to get a haircut, and surely I just needed to get a haircut. And the lady said, "Sir, if you go up the road, it's a bit cheaper. Like this is a bit too expensive." I was like, what do you think? I can't afford it? Like I need to get a haircut, and I need to get it now, and I don't care that it's $100, and I know that I could get it for $12, but I need to get it now. Like, but the reality is, like, she thought that I wasn't going to be afford. She asked me to pay for my haircut before I'd had it. It was like a cab fare, you know, like these sort of things are constant prejudices that we face every day, you know, and they're the things that I don't want to be, you know, that I hate being judged on, what we wear or what we drive or what we clothe, you know, because why can't we be successful, wealthy people as Aboriginal people today when we've worked to achieve it? You know, but I'm certainly not going to, you know, sort of settle to be judged just because I don't rock those stuff. Yes, mate?
Jeremy, I checked your Twitter feed before we drove over, and I just want to find out whether you've had any more problems with airlines labelling that beautiful musical instrument
as a bludgeoning tool. Well, Virgin have become very good friends of mine as a result of that. So, well, you know what? It's pretty sad that like this instrument is such a special instrument to me. It's the last didgeridoo that was made by my grandfather. You know, like while it's been polished in glass, I don't want to have to check it in, and I don't, you know, and so often we're fighting with people because but yeah, Gold Coast Airport, the lady goes, you could bludgeon someone to death with it. I was like, nah, I find that kind of offensive. You know, like, are you saying that I look like someone that would bludgeon someone to death? Or what are you saying? Like, you know, because I'm confused by what you're actually saying. You know, and, you know, I've since sort of, you know, reconciled some stuff with, you know, with the airlines about it, but we're trying to get to a point that I had this made perfectly to the overhead cabin size. So I've had it made to the size so it can fit. It's more just about educating the staff that this is not just a tourist instrument. This is an instrument that has been used in ceremony, but it's also been used, you know, travels around the world. And if it does not turn up, it can destroy my show, you know, because the reality is if I land in France and I have to do an opening, it's very difficult to find a didgeridoo really quickly, you know, in France. You know, like it's hard, and that's a hard thing it's not like a guitar that you can get anywhere. Like we need this to turn up. And so, and what I've found actually is it's easier for me to travel internationally with this instrument than it is here in my own country. Yeah, and that's the sad part. And so it's just education. It's about not getting frustrated. It's about how do we educate people to be more aware, to be more alert, because it upsets you when you get told you can't take the didgeridoo on, but you see someone getting on with a guitar. It's like, what's the difference? All right, yes.
I guess another follow-on question. So where in that time period did the music come out in you? Was it your Maori family?
You know what? Music and rhythm was always a part of everything for me. In fact, I will tell you that music is in a Polynesian family, music is a way of life. You have no choice. Rhythm and melody. And I have a bit of I guess it's probably, it's probably part of me that's on the spectrum, is that I count everything. I'm always counting, count sounds, that if I hear a dripping tap, I can tell you how many drips it drips in a minute. I can tell you, it drives me insane, my mind, because I can tell you how long it takes, the airplanes fly over my house, and I know that it takes 9 seconds before you can speak again. If you're having a conversation, I can tell you all of that sort of stuff, for me, counting time was how I learned to speak my language, because not only do I speak Gogo Yaranji, but I speak like Nyogo, like Gogo Nyogo, and I also speak Yolngu Mata. And the way that I learned to speak those languages was because I was listening to my grandfather speak, and I could listen to the time signatures of how he was speaking, and I realized that he was speaking in a different time to him, to different people, and I realized that must be the change of different languages that he was changing from, and because each language, all three languages have a different time signature. Music is one of those things that when I got given a didgeridoo for the first time, I fell in love with this instrument. That the yerak, it became an extension of me. And then playing the flutes, I was spending so much time in America. I was spending so much time with Native American families that I just wanted to teach myself how to play the flute. And it all came about because I got back from Australia I got back to Australia one year after performing I'd been at Sundance with the Lakota, and I was given a flute, and my daughter found my flute in my bag, not this one, the one that's just older than her, the 12-year-old, and I found the flute she found my flute in the bag, and she wanted me to play it for her, and I didn't know how to play it, but every night I would sit on the end of her bed, and instead of reading to her, I just taught myself how to play the flute. And in 2019, so in 2013, I became the first non-Native American person ever to win a Native American Music Award. Yeah. And it was for a piece called Kalima, which was named after my eldest daughter, which was a mix of the didgeridoo and the flute, and this poem that I'd written about, sort of our quest to know ourselves before we die. And it was, sort of that we spend so much time in life, in our young life, acquiring stuff that just is so irrelevant. And then as we get to the latter part of our life, we're trying to get rid of everything so we can get closer to know each other, to know ourselves, because the one person that you need to know the most when you're crossing over into that world is you need to know yourself, and are you happy with who you are? And so music for me, I don't know, I can't read music, although I'm very fortunate that I can play the flutes, and I can play guitars, and I play pretty much my obsessive mind is if I want to learn something, I learn it. And such is the place that has got me to where I am today, I think. All right, well, I'm going to finish with a piece of music that'll go from the didgeridoo into this flute. This flute is, it'll start with the didgeridoo and then go into the flute. And you can record it if you want. Go for it. It's a Native American flute with my shoelaces on it because I ran out of leather. All right. Does anyone have any other questions before we finish up? I think that.
Wondered why did you think that at that time in your life you went off the rails?
Why? I just, you know what, for me, I think I was always going off the rail. Like, one, you know, now I understand ADHD. I'm always like this. I would have been a shit of a kid to have in a classroom. I found myself living on the streets at 13 years old. I used heroin for the first time at 13 years old. It was the first drug I was ever exposed to. I then realized that on the streets, if you have nothing to live for and nothing to die for, you become kind of crazy and you become a bit of a commodity on the ugly streets of Sydney. And that's pretty much what happened. It was just, why did I find myself in trouble was because I had no one. The streets were a place that I found my home. And you know, when everything else was failing, it was the one place that I knew I could survive.
I've got another question. How did your grandfather find you?
So there was a lady called Pauline Dixon who was the Aboriginal liaison officer in one of the juvenile detention centres, and she found my family for me. And so it was with my adopted parents, but also with, well, not my adopted, but my permanent foster carers, because I could never be adopted, that I was, sort of led back to my family. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Thanks, bro.